Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the GBSN for Energy Transitions virtual series, Powering the Energy Transition, A Tale of Two Hemispheres. We are thrilled for our second event in this series, focused on repurposing legacy assets. Just as a few housekeeping reminders, this session will be recorded. Please keep your microphones muted. And we have reserved time to address audience questions at the end of today's program. That said, we encourage you to drop any comments and questions in the chat at any time and to respond to others. Lastly, we invite you to use the chat right now to introduce yourselves and where you're joining from. If you'd like to say a few words about the interests that brought you here today, please feel free to add those as well. Now I would like to introduce Julianne Inarelli, the Chief Impact Officer, to take the stage.
Hello, welcome. Thank you, Julie. As Julie mentioned, I'm Julianne Inarelli, the Chief Impact Officer for the Global Business School Network. And it's really a pleasure to greet you and thank you for joining us today. Those of you who are GBSN members will know GBSN as a not-for-profit network bringing together business schools and other organizations, businesses, foundations, policymaking bodies as well. But others of you are likely new to GBSN, and you're here today because of your commitments to business education and your recognition of the importance of business talent to sustainable development and economic success. But regardless, we all come together with a shared purpose to improve access to quality and locally relevant management education, especially in the developing world. And as Julie said, we would encourage you to drop a brief introduction to yourself in the chat so we can all get to know one another a bit better. We're here today because of the work of the Energy Transition Impact Community, one of several impact communities at GBSN that are really our key avenues for collaboration to take place. And these communities focus on a variety of topics highly relevant to today's business and our broader world. I would like to take a moment to introduce the leaders of the Energy Transition Impact Community. They had a vision for this event series and have worked hard to make it happen. We have with us today Sarah Craig and Yashar Jassi Faraqfal of the Rotterdam School of Management, Lawazi Ngubavana and Maurice Rodabay of Wits Business School, and Greg Bean of the University of Houston. And without any further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Greg Bean, our moderator for today, to introduce the session and today's speakers. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Julianne. Good morning, everyone. I am Greg Bean. I am the Executive Director of the Gutierrez Energy Management Institute at the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. And our organization is responsible for all the energy programs at the Bauer College, including the curriculum, research, and events such as this. Our GBSN Energy Transition Impact Community is focused on bringing business schools together to support the world's transition to a low-carbon, sustainable energy system, which will meet the needs of a growing global population. This is the second in a six-part series addressing different challenges associated with the energy transition. The series is designed to allow the business school community to share ideas and conduct joint programs that will enable business schools to be relevant contributors to industry needs. And just as a reminder, our next event in this series, our third part, will be focused on technology, and that will be held on July 25th. So I'd like to move to today's topic, which is repurposing legacy fossil fuel assets for the low carbon energy future. The fossil fuel industries own and operate trillions of dollars of assets that provide the vast majority of the world's energy needs today. However, many of these will not be able to continue to function as designed in a world where fossil fuel demand declines significantly and where remaining fossil fuel energy projects are required to be either low carbon or zero carbon emissions. To reduce the monetary cost to the global society of the transition to a low carbon energy world, There's a strong incentive to repurpose these assets so they can continue to operate and create value in the new low carbon energy world. And there are also other potentially significant benefits of repurposing these assets, including minimizing the economic and social impact of countries and local communities that are currently highly dependent on fossil fuel assets and businesses. To address this topic, we have four really excellent speakers today. Dr. Wouter Jacobs is our Global North academic representative. Dr. Jacobs is the founder and director of the Erasmus Commodity and Trade Center at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, which is a dedicated think tank supported by commodity trading industry. He initiated and leads the International Executive Program Leadership in Commodity Trade and Supply Networks at Erasmus. Wouter is a member of the Advisory Council of the J.P. Morgan Center for Commodities at the CU Denver Business School, the University of Colorado. And for 8 years, he has been involved as a fellow at Erasmus UPT. Wouter teaches MS Science courses at the Rotterdam School of Management and Erasmus School of Economics, and he has a PhD from Rabud University in Holland. Welcome, Wouter. Our second panelist is Evelyn Otten, who is our Global North practitioner representative. Evelyn is the Energy Transition Advisor at Shell Netherlands. Until recently, she was responsible for creating pathways for the industrial transition, including Shell's own assets in the Netherlands, which include a world-scale refinery and chemical facility. Currently, she is developing a strategy for renewable heat. Prior to this role, she spent over 2 decades in various global commercial and technical roles in LNG and the chemical sector. She holds an MSc degree in chemical engineering from Delft University in Holland. Welcome, Evelyn. I'd now like to turn to our 2 Global South participants. Dr. Stanley Semilani is our Global South academic representative. Dr. Semilani is head of stakeholder relations, ESG and sustainability at Sasol Limited. He joined Sasol from the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, where he was a senior researcher responsible for climate services, where he led climate change finance research as well as mitigation and adaptation measures for the South Africa's just energy transition. He was part of the team that worked on the adaptation aspects of the 2021 to 2030 updated national determination commitments, where he led the South African adaptation needs cost estimates. He's responsible for the Just Energy Transition Research Strategy developed at CSIR Energy Center. He's a thought leader in localization and regional economic diversification research in support of a just transition. Welcome, Stanley. Finally, Thulani Kabashi is our Global South practitioner representative. He is the founder and executive chairman of Build Africa Holdings since 2008. He's also the former chairman of Standard Bank Group and Standard Bank of South Africa Limited. He is a former chairman of Imperial Holdings Limited and MTZ Zakhele Limited. He joined Excom in 1993. In 2000, he became a chief executive of Excom, a position he held until April of 2007. His current company, Built Africa Group, develops and operates renewable energy plants and consults in energy efficiency. He has served as the executive chairman of Built Africa Group since its inception. Thulani is a registered town and regional planner and a corporate member of the South African Planning Institute, and he holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Ball State University in the United States and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Botswana. And in 1995, he completed the Program for Executive Development at IMD. Welcome, Thulani. We'd like to ask each of our 4 panelists now to provide some introductory perspectives on the topic of repurposing legacy fossil fuels assets. We'll start with our Global North panelist. Evelyn, over to you.
Thank you, Greg, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone in this call today. It's a pleasure to speak here today, and I'm going to give you the perspective of my experience with the industrial transition in the Netherlands as one of the European countries working towards a net zero emissions world by 2050 or earlier. Let me start with a bit of context. In the Netherlands, we have a very large energy intensive industry founded on abundance of natural gas in the past. And our country is located next to the North Sea, and with Germany next to us, there's close proximity to markets. So a thriving industry based on oil and natural gas. Back in 2017, our then government, when it came into power, announced a plan to really set some step changes in the energy transition and set ambitious targets to reduce the CO2 emissions. In the meanwhile, they have been further increased. But what the then government did is give each sector a target on how much CO2 to reduce by 2030 in order to roughly halve the emissions between 1990 and 2030, so that each sector would know, what they have to do. And there was then a whole process to determine what each sector, what actions to take to reduce the CO2 footprint. With that, for industry came a CO2 levy as a stick, if you will, an incentive to reduce emission, but also in the form of a carrot, some subsidies to help you make the change. So with that, each company knew exactly that doing business as usual is not a credible path forward. People need to act. And that brings me to repurposing assets. I think you can repurposing assets, you can view it on a different scale. If I start with a more macro scale, it's repurposing what we in the Netherlands call industrial clusters. These are groups of different industries together. For example, in the backyard of the Erasmus University is the Rotterdam Harbor, one of the largest harbors in the world, with dozens of kilometers of or miles, if you will, of industries, currently all based on fossil, but that will transition into greener, low carbon energy. And you can still make use of the same harbors, the same people, the same infrastructure to help make that transition. So that is really I would argue, on a macro scale. We can also import there the offshore wind, which will be built in the North Sea, or for example, import hydrogen or ammonia from overseas. On a more industrial asset scale, you have to think, for example, of a refinery or a chemical complex. The repurposing of assets is slightly different. Take, for example, the Pernis refinery, also based in the Rotterdam Harbor. The refinery has a plan to convert itself into an energies and chemicals park, and a North Star project that describes the pathway to convert from an oil-based refinery into this chemical and energy park that will have net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier, where so to an extent, some of the assets are physically repurposed, but more also you use the complex to add new additions. For example, they're building currently a big feedstock, biofuels plant that will generate sustainable aviation fuel, amongst others. I visited it yesterday. It's work in progress. It's energy transition. It's located in the same refinery. It will make use of the same infrastructure, the same people, the same docks, as the existing complex. So it's a good example how a refinery is not a static facility, but something that is in flux and will transition as well. when we look at really more individual assets, we find that some assets lend themselves better for repurposing than others. I think examples that are really good for repurposing are power cables. For example, there was a facility in the north of the Netherlands that could no longer sustain economic viability, went bust. But now it's going to be used for a battery location. So you use the same power cable, but in a completely different purpose. The other thing that you can repurpose are pipelines. And for example, in this country, we have many natural gas pipelines. And actually, part of it will be converted into a hydrogen service. Actually, today an announcement was made that they're going to really commission start the investment of the first stretch of that. You can also use depleted reservoirs that in the past contained gas or something else that are going to be repurposed for the injection of CO2. We call that carbon capture and sequestration. That's something that is also a helpful way to reduce emissions from existing industry. And even if you can't find a direct repurposing use, you can still scrap material and recycle them, although that's a lower form of recycling, but metal to metal kind of circular economy. So you see, there's different ways in which you can repurpose assets. Some of the advantages, I think, Greg, you already alluded to it. It can save cost. I think also you leverage the existence of people, of maybe existing permits. In the case of a crowded country like the Netherlands, it's also for space constraints. It can be an advantage to work in the same location because it might be difficult to find a new place. But equally, there are also some challenges. For example, a legacy asset is not necessarily does not become redundant necessarily from one day to the next. So sometimes during the renovation, the shop must remain open. And if you have multiple gas pipelines like we have in the Netherlands, you can convert one into hydrogen at a time and make that transition slowly. But the challenge is we're not closing down oil-based refineries already. It's a slow ramp down. And so you also need to ramp up your new alongside. And so that can be a hindrance in repurposing assets. I think another thing that is sometimes in the way are the regulatory requirements. We see an increasing pressure from regulators to clean up your assets as soon as it's lost its purpose, and that is to avoid that it becomes a stranded asset that no one takes ownership for anymore. So it sometimes leaves less time to make your plans how to transition from its previous use to its new use. And so that's I'm interested to hear also if others see that as well. So where does this leave us? I think repurposing assets has a great opportunity. It's, however, not a one size fits all. It will be different in each location, in each asset. And I think sometimes you also have to conclude that repurposing doesn't work. So it's not a one size fit all. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share with you today. I'm very interested what the other speakers have to say and what they contribute, and then happy to take questions at the end of all the sessions. Over to you, Greg, again.
Thank you, Evelyn. Appreciate your comments. Let's move on to our other Global North panelist, Wouter. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Good day, everybody, wherever you are at this moment. And thank you, Greg, for the introduction, and Evelyn for making a very clear statements on the energy transition, in particular in the Netherlands. So let me follow up on that, starting with a more macro perspective, indeed, from the Global North. I think the Global North has benefited enormously from the fossil fuel energy, the energy system based upon fossil fuels. We've created an enormous wealth and welfare out of this abundance and affordable fossil fuel business. So that's our legacy, or that's the legacy of fossil fuel for the global north. However, we are transitioning away to a more sustainable and renewable future. And me as a background in commodities trading, I obviously look at trade. Energy is the biggest commodity being traded across the world. And the role of trading is basically to transport or trade commodities, energy, from places of abundance to places of scarcity. That sounds simple, but the role of trading is in the end to manage these regional imbalances. So they have a particular utility there, and it works best when the prices are transparent and competitive, and there is a free market, so to speak. However, there are many externalities from the fossil fuel business that have never been priced in properly, right? And that's a major concern for us right now, how to do that. And particularly with all these capex and investments in large-scale assets that we have, in particular in the global north, but increasingly also in the global south. And trading, like I said, is bringing abundance to places of scarcity. And I think if we look at the energy transition in the global north and the pledges that we made in the global north, we can't produce domestically or regionally enough alternative energies to keep our system going. So what does that simply mean? We can build X amount of windmills on our North Sea. We can make X amount of electrolyzers in the port of Rotterdam. But in the end, that's not enough to power basically our economies. So we need to trade. We need other locations that can competitively produce energy for us and are willing to sell it at a competitive price. And that's where trading comes in. And I think that's where the Global South has a true competitive advantage. Not so much, I'm not saying that there isn't, but not so much constrained yet with these legacy assets. They can be built according to the new standards. However, these are enormous investments, and there comes the problem, because everybody sees that there are major opportunities there are major challenges, but every country has made policies, but are building policies, but they are not completely aligned yet with the pledges that have been made on the macro level in the COP26 agreements, etc. There are many pledges that governments have made, but the road to realize those pledges via policy remains relatively vague, or at least there are problematic inconsistencies there, because we have another set of problems there, because only half of the investments required for the energy transition are actually being allocated. At the same time, the investments in, let's say, the incumbent energy system, the fossil fuel business, are also lacking. It makes investors very nervous to invest in that space, because we want to transition away from that. So there is no, what is the long-term return on investment? It's difficult to quantify there, but at least it makes investors somewhat nervous. And then we are switching our dependencies, if we move into that energy transition, towards an entire new space, namely the critical minerals and metals that is required to power the energy transition, whether it's copper or nickel, lithium that we need in batteries and grids to simply other types of critical rare earth elements that are required for solar panels and what have you. And there the investments are also lacking. Plus the time to build a mining operation, to plan a mining operation and have it online is taking enormous amount of time, at least a decade, if not longer, let alone in the global north where it's even more difficult to have planning approvals for such intensive operations. So there we have a major problem. I think I don't have the answer right now, but I think that we need to realize that it's not only about oil refineries for making fuels, or it's connected to many other value chains and supply chains that are absolutely critical. And here you have another problem, that if we want to increase the mining output for all these critical metals and minerals to power our energy transition, we need a lot of fossil fuel energy at this stage. And it takes a lot of water and fossil fuels to get copper out of a mine in Chile, for that matter. So how to deal with that? I think decarbonization is the journey forward. I think bringing market incentives like carbon markets, carbon trading, carbon offsetting mechanisms is potentially a very promising way forward. Europe is leading in that space, but China, their carbon markets is still rather fragmented, but enormous, large in scale already, and is increasing in scale as well. And then that brings me to the final point of these other type of industries in chemicals or building materials like steel. There's an enormous challenge there as well. And looking at our legacy assets of steel making in the global north, I think it's very problematic. I think here, the global south, China, but also India, they can build steel mills according to newest technology and standards. But again, it comes at an enormous cost. But the advantage of these kind of products is that they continue to be part of the system. Once you have mined them, put them to use in construction, you can recycle them. But the investments are gigantic to, let's say, make a full decarbonized green iron ore that you can put into steel mills. I don't think that those costs, they are already enormous, can be actually carried in the global north for those legacy assets. So there are many opportunities. I'll leave it there. But the challenges are enormous, considering the interconnectedness between energy and all the other supply chains and value chains that power our lives. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you very much, Walter. So now we'd like to move to the Global South perspective and get some introductory comments from our two Global South participants. Let's start with Thulani. Over to you, please, sir.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. I want to just set a bit of context. If we look at South Africa, our economy has been built very much on a fossil fuel driven power system. So we have about 42,000 megawatts installed, roughly 5% of which is nuclear and 5% is hydro. This makes us, if we take the two big energy businesses, Eskom and Sasol, puts us quite high up in the top 10 world worst polluters. And driven by this, government has sought to decarbonize and to really support the growth of greener technologies into the power system. But just a little bit about the legacy assets that we have. It's a fleet that was built largely between the 1960s and the 1990s. We do have 2 coal stations that are at various stages of commissioning, but the bulk of the fleet really, it belongs to that era. Over the period, we've focused on life extension. So the assets have been given a few more years to go incrementally. But what is true is that in the next maybe 5 years or so, the majority of these will have to be decommissioned. So we have that challenge of a growing economy. We have the challenge of having to decarbonize. And we also are aware that assets are nearing the end of their useful lives. So in this context, I mean, government has adopted a just energy transition as the framework in which we make this journey. I have to say that this is contested territory, even within the policymakers themselves, because just energy transition to some extent is seen as an imposition from the global north. On the other hand, the number of people employed working in the current fleet, working in coal mines, clearly would be impacted. So much as I think it would be correct to say that the just energy transition provides the framework for this decarbonization journey, it does remain a little contested. We are making progress, though. Unlike the Netherlands, I can only speak of repurposing at a station level, and maybe just for purposes of this afternoon, just really keep it to an example. But before I do, I just want to mention that we in South Africa, and Southern Africa in particular, have got a lot of advantages in making a concerted move towards implementing green technologies. On the one hand, we do have the mineral base for what's required in these new technologies: lithium, copper, cobalt, manganese, and so on, in abundance. Secondly, we also have wind resources and solar resources very much in abundance. And I think with these two, we could focus on becoming a center of excellence for these green power technologies, so that while we are dealing with issues of repurposing, decommissioning, I think we need to put equally or even more effort in developing the competitive advantages that we do have. I firmly believe that this is the way forward. It also becomes an opportunity for reskilling our workforce, deploying new technologies, and you know, we have excellent training facilities to allow us to do that. I thought I would just mention at this point Komati Power Station, which is a station that was built in the 60s. The final unit was in fact commissioned in 1966. The station was then mothballed around 1989 due to overcapacity, as a lot of stations had been built in the 80s. However, in 2012, the station had to be brought back to service. And that was because of the energy constraints, which are still with us today. Now, there has been a plan to repurpose quite a few of these old stations near the period of decommissioning. In the case of Komati, the plans are for a potential 150 megawatts of solar and 70 megawatts of wind to be built on the site. The main advantage being that we can continue to use the associated transmission infrastructure, as well as, I guess, provide opportunities for communities in those areas. Now, the plans themselves go beyond just the one station, but phase one has already been put out to tender, and I think appointments have been made. So we're going to see the first 90 megawatts of solar, as well as 32 megawatts of wind, together with battery storage and gas being developed on this power station. That's a very useful model for us, given the size of our fleets. And this, as a pilot, I think will provide a lot of useful lessons about how this can be done most efficiently. We also are faced with transmission constraints. A lot of the new solar and wind assets are further south in our network, Northern Cape and Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and already there are serious transmission constraints. So by locating these assets at existing stations further to the north, this overcomes those constraints in putting the power into the grid. I would like to leave it there for now, and we'll deal with questions as we go. Thank you, Greg.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to now bring our last panelist, our second panelist from the Global South. Dr. Semilani, would you go ahead, please?
Thank you. Yeah, let me start by saying maybe there's a couple of things that I want to touch on in my opening remarks. But mainly, let me say, we all agree that climate change or climate change risk is a problem that we all need to contribute to. That's one. Secondly, we accept that as we speak now, renewable energy technologies are the cheapest technology if you compare. And I'll just elaborate further why I cover these things. There are opportunities and bottlenecks from the Global South perspective. And maybe I want to qualify the statement by saying a just transition from a Global South perspective, really it's about job creation. It's about creating alternative economic diversification options. The climate change becomes secondary. I'm not saying that's not a global problem, but I'm saying from a Global South perspective, we having challenges, one, in terms of growing our economy. We have challenges from creating jobs. Our economy has depended for many years on fossil fuel industries. And if you compare the value chain of fossil fuel, where you have less skilled human resources working in the coal mines and mining coal, which is used in South Africa, for example, to produce a number of products, including fuel, as well as generating electricity mostly. As you transition, because the government has taken a position to say, we are going to have a mix. We have an aging coal fleet, which is going to shut down between now and 2030. As those coal power stations would be closed, more renewables would be brought in. And I want to say also, from a South African context specifically, we have about two schools of thoughts that exist. although government has given a policy direction in terms of our integrated resource plan, that shows you how our energy outlook is going to look like moving forward. So you realize when you look at policy that more wind, in fact, wind is a winner as we speak on that policy. More wind, about 14,000 megawatts of wind would be procured, and a couple of solar power plants would be procured moving forward. So you could see that there is that shift that government is adopting, and because of climate change, of course. Now, what happens within this transition from a global south perspective? You have companies from the global north really, through a bidding, a public procurement system that our government uses, competing to generate mostly these renewable energy power plants. So traditionally, our system was not a distributed generation type system. You had one big monopoly utility owned by the state, generating electricity for many, many years. That is Eskom. And since 2010, independent power producers were introduced in the country. And even if you look the price per kilowatt hour from the projects that were initiated around 2011, we call them bid windows. The first bid window one, would realize that they were selling very expensive, because at the time PV and wind were still expensive, but the government still chose to procure those projects. And suffice to say, in South Africa, what makes renewable energy projects bankable is because the state has given a guarantee. Because right now, most of the IPPs from a utility scale point of view sell their power to the national utility, which is Eskom. Then Eskom will distribute. They own the country's transmission line, and then they would distribute. Until about 2 years ago, our Electricity Regulation Act was amended, and that allowed private power producers to now start to sell outside the national utility. So now they can sell to mines that are also faced with the transition challenge. They can sell to individual households, commercial and industrial. But before 2020, that was not the case in the South African context. That means also from the skills point of view and capacity point of view, you still need to transition. And the recent round bid window where independent power producers were awarded to build independent power producers, they had to negotiate local content policy. So the country has a local content policy, which is a policy aimed at making sure that the components that are used to produce renewables, a portion of them is sourced locally. Independent power producers were unable to meet those local content conditions, and they could not reach financial close because of that, because it's a bidding process, and every independent power producer is trying to sell the cheapest electricity. And somehow, I say, that cheap electricity perpetuates what I call an unjust transition. If you compare in the South African context what solar, PV, and wind is selling at, they are way cheaper than what coal is currently selling at. And for me, I don't see the need why they should be cheaper than what they are, because you can even sell them 20 cents per kilo hour more and start to generate or develop funds where that money that is extra, you could start to have something like a just energy transition fund that will ensure that the job creation and economic development that is required in the country, you would have a fund of some sort. Because right now, individual companies are putting together their own plans in terms of how they are going to deal with the socio-economic impacts of transitioning to low carbon technologies. So yeah, because as you look, our economy is really heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and that means a portion of our manufacturing in the country, a portion of our transport sector, a portion of our construction sector, all will be impacted negatively as we adopt cleaner sources of technology. Worse is where you have the renewable energy resources in the country. It's completely a different area relative to where you have coal power stations, which we would repurpose. Maybe my closing remarks thus far suffice to say, and we will welcome the questions at the end, to say that in South Africa, per se, 90% of the renewable energy jobs are generated during construction. And construction really, at max, it lasts between 12 to 24 months. And how those jobs are quantified, they are quantified in job years, meaning that two individuals might have worked 12 months each, and that would be, or 6 months each, and that would be equal to a one job year. Really, that is the challenge that the Global South is facing. Yeah, and hence, if you think about the COP26 negotiations, there was a lot of call for a damage and loss from the Global South perspective, because we all know that the Global North has grown, has developed using fossil fuels. The Global South still has these resources, the fossil fuel resources in abundance, but we cannot tap into them because of the climate change risk. Therefore, something has to be done between the Global South and Global North to ensure that we adopt fairly in a just manner low carbon technologies and ensure that we manage the climate change risk that we are facing. For example, I was checking stats before I joined. In Q1 of 2023, South African solar imports reach an all-time high with a record of about $200 million. So it means that we are not manufacturing these components. And when I say in the South, Global South, there are two school of thoughts. There are those that saying, why should we not tap into the resources that we currently have? Because we did not create the climate change problem. And there's another school of thought that says we need to deal with the climate change risk. Therefore, we need to adopt renewables. But that has to happen in a just manner where you could still have the opportunity to manufacture these renewable energy components. And South Africa has a potential. For example, if you think about one of our provinces, Eastern Cape, Daimler Chrysler manufactures C200 in that region. If you think about an area called Gqeberha, it used to be called Port Elizabeth, VW manufactures cars. So there is capacity to manufacture within South Africa and even feed in the African continent that has a lot of unelectrified regions or areas, as well as beyond the African market. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stanley. And thanks to all the other panelists. Appreciate those insightful introductory comments. What we'd like to do now is move to the panel discussion, where we'll ask the panel to address some specific issues and challenges associated with repurposing these assets. Many of these have been touched on already, and so we just want to dive in a little bit deeper on those. The discussion around the Global South, with particular focus on South Africa, talked about repurposing assets, most particularly repurposing coal power plant assets and the associated infrastructure with that. In the Global North, using the Netherlands as an example, we talked about repurposing both upstream and downstream fossil fuel assets. So we've seen some different areas of focus in terms of what are the existing fossil fuel assets that we need to repurpose. We talked a little bit about the benefits of repurposing and why we're doing it and what is the rationale, but I'd like to maybe get a little bit more perspective and particularly focus on the difference in the drivers generally between the Global South and the Global North. And maybe we'll start with the colleagues in the Global South, maybe Thulani with you. If you could talk a little bit more about, what are really the key drivers and how are investments prioritized when you think about it. We've talked about, obviously, the reduced need for capital that can be associated with repurposing assets. We talked about jobs and communities and things like that. But maybe you could talk a little bit more specifically about how industry and government in the Global South thinks about the drivers for this and how they're trying to make these things happen.
Thank you. I think I did touch a little bit on that.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But I think the kind of coal fleet that we have by world standards is quite substantial, and I think that there's an acceptance that they do have to be decommissioned, and there are various ways of determining when that happens. But their lives are finite; that cannot be changed. So we have this infrastructure. If we just stay with around where most of these stations are, you have already a power line, a gas line coming through the region from Mozambique. The solar resource is reasonable. Wind isn't that great, and so if one is driven by least cost and maybe least disruptive, it makes sense to put some of these new technologies on those sites because the infrastructure exists. The communities around there are already skilled, much as you cannot absorb all of them. That's a fact. But there are those key things that are already in place. So I think if one is not just driven by, if one is only driven by least cost, you have to look at those sites, I think, to begin with. That's one of the drivers that I would point to. Perhaps another driver would be, I suppose, a way of accelerating our transition. So on the one hand, Stanley has already referred to the bid window process. That has brought new assets in areas where those resources are most abundant. So wind has generally been in the Eastern Cape and, solar in the Northern Cape. Now, you do want to end up retaining grid balance relative grid balance. So if all the assets are in one area of the country, you are going to need some in future. Once you've decommissioned, you are going to need some, injection in the north. And therefore, utilizing what exists to create these assets, I think makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Stanley, anything to add in terms of drivers? Anything that we haven't talked about? We've talked about jobs and community impact. Anything around, government revenues associated with fossil fuels? Anything else that we haven't really touched on?
Yeah, I think what's important is to understand that we trade. So South Africa is not in isolation. And if you look, for example, the EU regulations on carbon intensity, you can see what is the EU position in terms of what type of imports they're going to have. So while you have the global climate change problem that you resolve, but you could see pressures on the export policy to say the type of products that you'll have to export, they're going to go through a test of carbon intensity. And I think that is important so that you balance, because you run a risk of not being able. So we have companies that have depended on fossil fuel for many years and exporting products to the EU and elsewhere globally. They have to manage that risk and ensure that they transition their operations if they still want to keep those markets. I think that's important as well.
Great. Okay. For our Global North panelists, any additional thoughts on drivers for repurposing that we haven't already talked about? Eveline?
Maybe one thing to add that is maybe also in contrast of the challenges of the South, and that is jobs. And I'm surprised myself that I'm going to say this, but actually we have a shortage of forced labor. So that is actually a blocker in the energy transition, is access to labor. So in a way, repurposing is like making use of the same infrastructure in the wider sense of the word, helps, to minimize new labor forces required. And what you see, for example, I was alluding earlier to this biofuels plant that we're adding in the Rotterdam Energy and Chemicals Park. Part of it will be built as modules and shipped in. And one of the reasons is that it's the manpower is then from another country. And so that's maybe a driver that is different, and maybe that's a win-win in the end. I don't know, but that could be that I think is a different perspective. Maybe I think another thing that I maybe I didn't mention so clearly is maybe it just so happens that where is our industry focused? That's on the sea, mostly on the seashore, because that's where the ships come in with products and for import and for export. It so happens that offshore wind is kind of the key ingredient for the renewable economy. And that happens to be offshore as well. So the landing points are actually there where the clusters can use the energy straight away, and it avoids, again, infrastructure in deep inland. So that's another thing where we see that it very much coincides. Does that mean that all the new industry will be in those clusters? No, it won't. But I think it does, gives them at least, it's probably the first point of call.
Excellent. Was there anything to add about drivers that we haven't touched on?
In terms of drivers, I would like to mention geopolitics. I think that's a major driver for either constraining or pushing forward in terms of energy transition. But what we have seen with the unfortunate events in the Ukraine, but our dependency on the supply of gas from in this case hostile trading partner, is something that we want to avoid. But switching from one major carriers of energy to others creates new types of dependencies. And I think governments are struggling to, at the one hand, have all these pledges in multilateral fora and etc., while having to deal with the realities of geopolitical risk and great power rivalries. And you see it even in the global north itself, with cross countries within the EU, but also between the EU and the US. And I think that complicates the issue, but I think also, at least from a European perspective, is that we learned our lesson the hard way in being dependent on the supply of fossil fuels. But however, we are now dependent also on the supply of critical minerals from particular countries. So I think without having a moral judgment about what is right or wrong in terms of geopolitics, I think it is a major driver in shaping expectations and results.
Great, thank you. I'd like to move to another area with respect to repurposing fossil fuel assets, and that is some of the different challenges associated with that, whether they are environmental, regulatory, dealing with legacy liability issues. What are you seeing as some of the emerging challenges and things that are really going to have to be addressed in order for us to have widespread repurposing of these assets? And maybe we'll stick with the global north, maybe Eveline.
I think I already addressed a few. So the concern from governments, rightfully so, that you cannot leave your asset behind, and you need to restore it to take away any pollution, if anything. And I can understand the concerns there, that it needs to be cleaned up. But sometimes you need some time to think about what you want to do with it. To give you an example, we have offshore platforms in the North Sea. They are used for the exploration of gas or oil, for that matter. When the gas fields are depleted, you could convert it into a hub for carbon capture and storage or for offshore hydrogen. But it's this is really one where one thing needs to end first, and then you can convert its purpose to something new. You cannot do it simultaneously. It's the permits alone will take a long time, and at the same time there's a driver to decommission your assets. So that's something that needs to be addressed, and it's a careful balance, because I also understand that you don't want to leave assets there left alone where the owner no longer feels responsible. So that is something that needs to be managed. I think when environmentally, what's a concern that I really place a lot in the Netherlands is that we try to address climate change. At the same time, we also have local pollutions, and especially in the Netherlands, for example, it's the nitrogen issue is a big problem. So sometimes for doing one project well, you need to have a permit for something else, and it's a balance of maybe an increase in NOx emissions, but a little bit of increase in one, where you which is needed to reduce a lot of CO2. And to give you one real life example, currently the whole country is basically in a kind of construction lockdown, if you will. There's one project called Portos. That's a CCS project, carbon capture and sequestration. It's when in operation, it's supposed to really store a lot of CO2, but during during construction, it will emit some NOx. Permit has not been granted, and therefore the project is currently on hold. And these are the challenges that we have to balance. And so which interest prevails? And I think that's a real challenge that we can probably that probably also applies in the global south, maybe on different topics, but it's always a balance of two things.
Okay. Wouter, anything to add? Any challenges on repurposing the various assets that we haven't touched on that we need to be aware of?
Well, I already mentioned the investors' appetite, and so that's already been covered, and the risk and reward ratio there. But I think if you take into account the policy frameworks that are differentiated across countries in the EU with very local aspects, to give you one example, one promising import flow of renewable energy is, for instance, ammonia as a carrier of hydrogen. There is a lot of ambition also in the port of Rotterdam with private investors willing to expand storage and conversion facilities. However, there's a lot of uncertainty from an environmental regulation point of view, in particular about safety. And there you see the regional body that oversees, let's say, the environmental compliance and zoning requirements is very reluctant, or let's say, to award approval for such projects. So there's initiative, and at the same time a lot of uncertainty in terms of safety, in this case for the particular commodity of ammonia. So yeah, also there on a local level there are restrictions of what can be done or not.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to shift the discussion to financing, and I think particularly with a focus on the global south. We've talked a lot about the needs for investment to repurpose these existing assets, particularly in the case of South Africa, for example, the coal-fired power assets, and take account of the challenges associated with reconfiguring the workforce and adapting other industries. I'd like to ask our Global South panelist, maybe starting with Stanley, to talk a little bit about your perspective on the financing challenges. What are some thoughts about where this finance is going to come from? Are there some unique ideas about how finance can be raised both within the country as well as from external sources? Interested in your perspectives on this issue.
Thank you. Look, the current fiscal position of African countries, South Africa included, is not in a position to finance new infrastructure. And if you look how renewables, particularly, or renewable energy development has been financed in South Africa, they use a concept called PPP, public and private sector partnership, where you have a private sector playing a role and a state, and sometimes or mostly on renewables, the state has really played from the policy point of view, so enabling policies for those transactions to take place. Secondly, from a finance point of view, commercial banks, FDIs, I don't think they'll continue to fund coal moving forward. That's not going to happen. So that's going to dry up. So from a South African perspective, while we know we are shutting down some of the power stations because they've reached their end of life, I don't think for new investments there's even finance for anything that is fossil fuel. So I think in the short to medium term, financiers are interested in gas. as a transition fuel. I think post 2030 gas, there'll be question marks once you get to 2035 in terms of what's happened. So what enables gas for now is the cost of green hydrogen per kilogram. So it's not yet that bankable. So anyone that is doing that is trying to prove the concept that they can actually do this. But yeah, those are my initial thoughts. So basically, that is why in South Africa, I saw even in Vietnam, there was a just energy transition investment plan that the countries are busy developing. And you'd see all those investments are dependent on international funding, which for some reason also, if you compare in terms of the interest rates that are being charged, international money tends to be cheaper than what you would pay for sometimes from our local commercial banks. So that is, at least that's my view in terms of how financing side is going to play between now and 2035.
Okay, great, thanks. Talani, any thoughts from you on financing, challenges, new mechanisms, new sources of financing for these kind of repurposings in the Global South?
My own experience is that there isn't a shortage of funding. On the one hand, you have concessional soft loans which are offered, but you find that the conditions for those soft loans actually require certain policy reforms. And that is where the difficulty comes, because the policy makers are not moving at the same pace. And you have a very strong labor movement that also isn't moving at the same pace because they're concerned about job losses. So you find that, in effect, what appears to be an abundance of funding is truly not accessible. So I think you'd recall that coming out of COP26, we had a just transition fund of $8.5 billion soft loans that is available to us. I don't think we've used any of that simply because we're not meeting the criteria in terms of reforms that have come as conditions with that. We had visits from the prime ministers of Denmark and Netherlands just last week, and a lot of agreements were signed, a lot of pledges were made, but it's always the devil's in the detail every time. On the other hand, commercial banks are quite happy to make funding available. In fact, if you look over the last 5 years, each bank has grown its renewable energy lending book substantially. But that is never sufficient. You also need some kind of concessionary funding coming into the system, either on the equity side or on the debt side. So it's a little bit of a contradiction. We can see the money, but using it isn't that straightforward.
Excellent, thank you. That's quite insightful. So we've talked about a number of different areas, different aspects of repurposing legacy fossil assets, some of the differences between global north and global south as represented primarily by the fossil industry in the Netherlands and Northwest Europe compared to Southern Africa, represented by South Africa. I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance as we kind of take a step back. Is there something significant with respect to repurposing fossil fuel assets in terms of enabling the repurposing of this? Is there anything that we haven't touched on specifically that you want to make sure that our audience is aware of with respect to how do we actually get this done and maximize the reasonable repurposing of fossil assets? And maybe I'll start with Vulture on this one.
Well, I've taking one step back then, okay, like Tulani already mentioned, money is everywhere, or it's quite abundant. So how to put that capital efficiently, allocate that and put that capital to work, I think is the greatest challenge. Having this formula right to have pledges that we collectively define in the COP26 and COP28 agendas, having those pledges, but finding the right policy formulas that actually allow us to reach those pledges is the critical. I don't have that formula, otherwise there wouldn't be a problem. But I think that's the key challenge here, and I think having, if you can define that right formula, and it's trial and error in many cases, and some will win and some will lose. But we need to push harder to get that formula right.
Great. Eveline, any last thoughts? Anything that we haven't talked about that's critical to this repurposing effort?
Yeah, I think maybe touched on indirectly, but to make it explicit, I think it's collaboration or partnerships. This is something that you barely do alone. You need help. It's the public and private sector working together, but often also companies together or different parts of government, as centralized, decentralized. So this is not something that we can do all by ourselves.
Great. And then finally switching to our Global South colleagues, Stanley, your thoughts? Anything that we've missed here about repurposing assets? What would be enablers, challenges that need to be overcome? Anything we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I think what's important is to think about this from a value chain point of view. That's important. Because if the current suppliers would not be ready for low carbon technologies, so you're also going to have a shift, and which is what we're trying to avoid, people moving to areas where there would be new economic opportunities or investments. So I think we are leaving behind those that are feeding the sector that is constantly declining over time. And I think there's a need to ensure that they adapt to the new sectors and technologies that would be adopted moving forward.
Okay. And finally, Lonnie, last thoughts, anything we haven't touched on?
I don't think we've dealt with it explicitly, but I think the need for harmonizing policy and for really, you know, it's very inefficient to be having initiatives led by champions in the absence of coherent policy that everybody has bought into. So we do spend energy and time because there are differences between policymakers about which way we should be going. And I think spending effort in that area would really make things a lot easier. There is a continuum between these actions. You know, extend the life of a plant as far as is economically reasonable to do, decommission it, repurpose the site, support new renewable areas in other areas, and so it can go on. But we just don't have, in my view, harmony in that space. And I think getting that, an effort in that would help.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, panelists. I really appreciate the thoughts, the variety of perspectives, and some very specific, you know, issues and challenges from the different perspectives. I think it's been very helpful for our audience. I'll go back to Giuliani. Do we have any questions from the audience? We've got time for one or two questions.
We do. Earth News 365 says, is it correct that funding in the Global South has come in the forms of loans? And this is perhaps difficult against country debt because even soft loans must be repaid.
Okay, any thoughts from our panelists, particularly our Global South panelists?
I'm not quite sure if I heard it clearly. Is it written in the chat room? Or?
Maybe you could repeat it.
Yes, I just dropped it in the
I've
chat.
just seen it. Okay. I've just seen it. In the case of South Africa, I don't think this is a problem. You know, we could take on more debt, more foreign debt. But again, it's a question of priority. So at first, the impression was that the just transition funding was in fact more of a grant. Clearly, it wasn't. And in fact, it is a soft loan. I think it's one that the country can afford, in my view. Just has to be within the priorities that National Treasury has set. But capacity is not an issue.
Okay, Stanley, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, I would not add much except just to clarify. So when I said other people call this an unjust transition, to say I'm expected to adopt these low carbon technologies, but you want me to go through debt to do that. And I'm saying others, not everyone. There's a perception in the Global South. That's a narrative that then goes around and having these type of discussions that we're having and saying, so we must always be indebted to Europe and Global North and so on, because there is a climate change problem that we did not create. And partnerships in terms of how do we meet each other halfway are important. So I don't think Global South can get everything for free. That's not practical in my view. But there has to be a partnership of some sort to say, how do we enable a smooth transition, whether from skills development, whether from other areas, but there has to be that discussion that sometimes we do not touch that, and then you have a narrative coming from everywhere else, and it becomes as if transitioning to low carbon technologies is incorrect, whereas it is correct.
Okay, do we have one last question?
Yes, Charles asked, I think it was Dulani who mentioned the potential for building a cluster of excellence. How would it work for the rest of Africa to benefit well? Is there a danger of injustice within Africa itself emerging?
I think we have an excellent example already in the telescope project. What is it called? The SK7. You can help me, but where in fact there's collaboration between African countries. So I think South Africa probably wouldn't be doing that on its own. If we look at the minerals that we need, some of them are in DRC, some are in Zimbabwe. There's a basis for collaboration. The Square Kilometer Array project is an example where there is such cooperation.
Okay. Anything else on this one? Okay, so I'd first of all like to thank our four panelists very much. I really appreciate your thoughtful insights and difference in perspectives and some very specific comments on repurposing assets, which are kind of priority assets in your different regions. And we talked about drivers and challenges, be they environmental permitting or financing, and then some very interesting thoughts at the end about partnerships and value chain perspectives and harmonizing policy. So I feel like we provided a good view on repurposing assets from the two different perspectives, and I'd like to thank you very much for participating in that. I'd like to encourage all of our attendees to sign up for our next event, which will be on the technology requirements and challenges for the transition, and that will be on July 25th, so in approximately 1 month or 4 weeks from today. So I'd like to thank everybody for their participation. I'll turn it back over to Julianne for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to you all for sticking around today. Thank you to our panelists for being here and for really illuminating this topic. And I know many of you will go forward and continue to carry this reflection and conversation in other channels and other contexts. And we invite you to also reach out through the website to join the Energy Transition Impact community to make sure you stay in the loop of future events and can continue to be part of this conversation, which is clearly so very important. Thank you all again.